From inventing swagger to being the most quoted writer in the English language, Shakespeare left one of the greatest cultural legacies in human history. We all came across his plays in school, but what are some of the darker sides of his life that teachers don't mention? William Shakespeare was born in a market town called Stratford-upon-Avon on April 23, 1564. His father, John Shakespeare, was a highly respected farmer and glove maker. John was very popular in his hometown, being elected from official ale tester to high bailiff, a modern-day mayor. But John had a dirty secret. He was working in the illegal wool trade. When he was caught, he was fined so severely that he had to give away most of his property. He also wasn't able to pay for William's education anymore, who was 13 at the time. There are no records of William's life for the following 5 years. Most biographies agree that Shakespeare received his education at King's New School, the free school in Stratford-upon-Avon. When he turned 18, the romantic drama started. Young William had gotten 26-year-old Anne Hathaway pregnant. As he was under the age of consent, which was 21, he had to ask for Anne's father's permission to marry Anne. Some historians argue that Anne manipulated William into getting married, as it was highly unusual for a woman to be unmarried by her age. So unusual that some people called old maids witches. Perhaps Anne saved her social status by putting her young husband in a difficult position.
Back then, if a young man was already a father, he was no longer eligible to become an apprentice in a skilled trade, so getting a woman pregnant as a teenager would essentially sentence a man to a life of poverty, and he would be doomed to work in the lowest paying jobs for the rest of his life.
William and Anne got married in November 1582, and by May the next year, they had their first daughter, Susanna. 2 years later, they had twins, Judith and Hamnet. The hazy period between 1585 and 1592 is referred to as the lost years. The lack of written records gives way to hearsay, and stories such as Nicholas Rowe's, Shakespeare's first biographer. Rowe claims that Shakespeare fled Stratford-upon-Avon for London in order to escape prosecution for deer poaching. Another story has it that Shakespeare went to London and started working in the theater world by minding the patrons' horses. The truth is, we don't know what was the moment that Shakespeare decided to be an actor. However, by 1592, he had left his wife and kids at home and gone to London to pursue a career in the London theater scene. His name appears that year in a work by Robert Greene, a famous playwright of the time. Supposes he is as well able to bombast out a blank verse as the best of you. And being an absolute Johannes factotum, is in his own conceit the only Shake scene in a country. Greene insulted Shakespeare for punching above his weight, trying to match university-educated playwrights like Christopher Marlowe and Greene himself. Johannes factotum means jack of all trades, an insulting claim that Shakespeare was a small-town boy, uneducated and only able to tinker with others' works rather than be his own creative genius. This timely remark goes hand in hand with latter-day claims that Shakespeare was a fraud and that someone else was writing his famous plays. However, these claims were rejected by historians with several arguments which we will delve into later. The late 1500s was an age of economic expansion for Britain under Elizabethan rule, and people were investing in theater in an unprecedented way. But actors didn't have the honorable status of today. In fact, they were considered to be at the bottom of the social hierarchy alongside ladies of the night. Shakespeare began working for a company called Lord Chamberlain's Men. He worked mainly as an actor, only submitting a script for a play every so often. He also published poems and sonnets with the help of rich patrons. Although few, Shakespeare's plays became very popular, so the theater company started performing these every day at the Globe Theatre. This is the famous London theatre that still performs Shakespeare's plays today. But in the 1590s, the Globe was on the other side of the Thames River and it wasn't free. Lord Chamberlain's Men had to rent it out for every play. But Shakespeare's plays became so popular that Londoners from all around town would come to see their amazing special effects, trapdoors, fireworks, and live animals. Even the royal family would see his plays regularly. After Queen Elizabeth died and James I became king, he sponsored Lord Chamberlain's Men and changed their name to the King's Men. A few years later, Giles Allen, the owner of the Globe, wanted to tear it down and sell the land. He ended the lease with the King's Men, and this was a very threatening event to the company. All other London theaters, like the Rose or the Swan, were fully booked. But the actors had a plan. They promised Allen to dismantle the theater for free as long as they were allowed to put materials to better use. If Allen knew their plan, he would have never agreed. But he didn't. They quickly tore down the theater in one night, then crossed the Thames and reassembled it on the southern bank.
They had the exact same performance space without having to pay their rent. This stunt became the talk of the town and only made their company even more popular.
In 1594, Shakespeare published his first entirely fictional play, A Comedy of Errors. It's rich with slapstick humor, puns, and wordplay. Oh yeah, Shakespeare invented thousands of words and expressions that we still use today.
We reckon he made up about 1,700 words.
Just made them up?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow. He made up the phrase, eaten me out of house and home.
Yeah.
Be all and end all is
Yeah.
from Macbeth.
Yeah.
Kill with kindness is from Taming of the Shrew.
Right.
Laughing stock he made up for Merry Wives of Windsor. All that glitters is not gold
Yes.
from Merchant of Venice.
By 1597, Shakespeare was rich enough to buy a house for his family in Stratford-upon-Avon. But here is something you didn't hear in school. Shakespeare was bisexual. How do we know? Well, one hint is that he always performed with an all-male cast, with men cross-dressed and often kissing on stage. He also dedicated 126 sonnets to a young man he called Fair Youth. The man in hue appears in 2/3 of Shakespeare's sonnets, and Shakespeare famously writes about him, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" The sonnets were hidden, then edited, having all the male pronouns replaced with female ones. But historians today are going back to the original versions. There is some evidence that the fair youth was most likely Henry Wriothesley, one of Shakespeare's first patrons. In the dedication of the sonnet Fair Youth, the initials Mr. W.H. can be seen. Another piece of evidence about Shakespeare's orientation is the lack of mentions of his wife, Anne. She doesn't appear in any of his plays, and in his will, this is all that Shakespeare says about her. "Item I give unto my wife are the second best bed and the furniture." It was common in the 1600s to write a few romantic words about your spouse in your will. The lack of these in Shakespeare's case is telling. On June 29, 1613, the Globe caught fire during a performance of Henry VIII due to the play's fireworks effects. It was completely destroyed, and a deeply affected Shakespeare retreated to Stratford-upon-Avon with his family. This wasn't the first time he suffered a great loss. In 1596, he lost his son Hamnet, most likely to the bubonic plague, which ravaged London in multiple waves during that time. It is believed that Hamlet was written in the aftermath of this loss. Shakespeare died aged 52 on April 23rd, his birthday, in 1616. Although in his will he wrote that he was perfectly healthy, historians argue that his handwriting in the last 3 years was increasingly shaky, possible proof of syphilis, considering his young age. Hundreds of years after his death, his work's authenticity has been debated by various historians, the biggest argument being that it's not really credible that a simple small-town boy without academic education was able to write works with such complex references.
There's something rather snobbish about it. The
Exactly.
idea that, you know,
Yeah.
that
A common man couldn't have written
common
this
man
stuff. Exactly.
didn't have the brain power.
Yeah.
There are records of Shakespeare collaborating with playwright Thomas Middleton, and he would likely bounce ideas off his fellow actors at the Globe. But this was very common practice, and there is very little doubt over just how creative and intellectually rich Shakespeare's plays are. The rhymes, puns, and wordplay in his original plays are so complex that a reader today would probably miss half. His human observations and social satire show that Shakespeare was a truly observant artist who made the most of every interaction. Most of the chaotic situations that his characters would find themselves in are still relatable. Shakespeare created a realistic world where no one was good or bad, and everybody had very tough decisions to make, each with their own consequences. Explaining human nature in moving ways is probably his greatest legacy. In the end, comedy prevails, and he encourages his audience to laugh in the face of the most tragic situations. It's perhaps unsurprising that Shakespeare is the most influential writer to date. What do you think Shakespeare's greatest legacy is? And what's your favorite Shakespeare work? How does it apply to today's world? Let us know in a comment. And before you leave, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel.